Whether you hydrate to live or live to hydrate, Liquid IV quenches your thirst faster than water alone. With 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 vitamins and nutrients for everyday wellness, all in a single sugar-free stick. However you hydrate, grab your Liquid IV Hydration Multiplier sugar-free in bulk nationwide at Costco, or get 20% off your first order when you go to liquidiv.com and use code SCARY at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code SCARY at liquidiv.com.
Hello, I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. Last night's new moon means the full moon will be here soon, and it may leave you feeling a bit different, braver, maybe even more erratic. Historically, such nights see heightened crime, increased hospital visits, and more overall madness. It's attributed to the primal pull of nature. Those unable to control this urge will incite trouble, earning the label lunatics, from lunar, as in, the moon made me do it. So beware, don't give in to your inner animal on the night of a full moon. Feeling unhinged could lead to danger all around you. First, how to protect yourself from evil, followed by the man that never leaves. Finally, in our last story, the monster of Dole. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to remind you that this podcast is available ad-free if you subscribe on Spotify or Apple. We've been seeing a lot of comments about how many ads run during our show, and we wanted to say that you can avoid that by paying a small monthly fee, depending on the plan you select. And please take a minute to rate and review this podcast wherever you are listening. You can do it right now or after you've listened. And you can also share the episode with a friend who you want to scare. These are just a few of the things you can do to help Something Scary continue to grow, and it only takes a minute. Thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for all of the support of our listeners. So, want to hear something scary? Lunar Lunacy. Sometimes we take for granted the little things other people do to help us, and by the time we realize it, those people might be dead and gone, like in this story inspired by Madeline. As a child, I was quite familiar with my grandmother's peculiar superstitions. She would throw salt over her shoulder to cancel bad luck, and she always knocked 3 times on wood if someone said something she didn't want to happen. She firmly believed that lighting white candles during a full moon would ward off evil spirits from our home. She even kept a large box of white candles fully stocked in the kitchen for the nights the full moon came out. Although I wasn't particularly close to her rituals always stuck with me as strong childhood memories. I also couldn't shake the sense of unease the full moon candles always left me with. Now, as a parent myself to 3 children, Elizabeth, Daniel, and my youngest, Jackson, those childhood memories seem distant. But with my grandmother ill and nearing the end of her life, I found myself revisiting all those eerie recollections I had growing up. Upon visiting my grandmother one last time with my kids in tow, she pulled me aside with a grave expression. "Amelia, listen to me carefully," she began, her voice tinged with urgency. "Your house and your children are in danger. It's haunted by an evil presence that I've been trying to keep at bay for years. Take these." She pulled from beside her bed a box filled with white candles and small bottles of mysterious substances sealed with white wax and incense. I struggled to contain my disbelief at what she was saying. I tried to digest the idea my house had been haunted this whole time. Then I thought better of it and chalked it up to her rapidly declining mental health. Brushing her cold cheeks with my hand, I smiled. I begged her not to worry about us and to focus on getting some rest, and everything would be fine. Tears welled up in her eyes as she told me she has never lit the candles on the full moon. That was part of my protection. She was scaring me. I just wanted her to go peacefully. I tried to reassure her everything would be fine, and I quickly changed the subject to the kids' school projects. It's clear she was declining rapidly, and it was time for us to leave. But her unnerving concern struck me as I kissed her goodbye for the last time and left the room. On the car ride home, I got a call from the nurse saying she had passed. My heart broke, but I took solace in knowing she was now resting peacefully. Returning home, I absent-mindedly placed the bag of items she gave me in the corner of the front hall, preoccupied with the task of daily life and making phone calls to other loved ones about my Gram's passing. As night fell, an inexplicable chill filled the air despite the warmth of spring setting in. Ignoring the sensation, I proceeded with my evening routine. Around 10 p.m., with the kids in bed, I finally began to doze off to sleep after a long, exhausting day. Just then, the tranquility of the night was shattered by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. My heart raced as I crept out of bed, silently checking on each of my children, all still fast asleep in their rooms. Confused, I dismissed the noises as my imagination playing tricks on me, and I attempted to settle back into bed. But sleep eluded me as I tossed and turned, an uncommon occurrence for someone who typically drifted off effortlessly. Hours passed, and as the clock struck midnight, an ominous sensation came over me. Instead of tossing in my bed, I tried to lay as still as possible to hear every creak and sound that would be out of the ordinary. My bed began to tremble, the movement growing increasingly violent until I found myself pinned down to my mattress, unable to move. In the dim light of the room, a massive figure appeared before my eyes, hanging over me, its form translucent and ethereal. I could barely see it if it weren't for the full moon lighting up my bedroom. Shit, the full moon. I hadn't lit any candles, and for the first time in decades, neither had my grandmother. Suddenly a voice, chilling in its otherworldly tone, spoke directly into my mind.
You are the chosen one, destined to haunt this house until you find another victim.
Its words searing into my consciousness, panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of my situation. How was this possible? What had my grandmother warned me about? Before I could comprehend the full extent of my situation, darkness consumed my senses, and I found myself adrift in a realm between the living and the dead. Time lost meaning, and I wandered desolate corridors of my own home, prisoner to forces beyond my understanding. I hovered above my own body, watching as my children found my body unable to wake me from a forever slumber. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, yet I remained trapped within the confines of my spirit body in the house. The memories of my former life faded, replaced by an insatiable hunger for release, a release that could only come through the torment of another soul. And so, the cycle continued, a tragic tale of despair and loss echoing through the halls of a tainted house. Of course, I waited for my children to be moved out. I couldn't do that to them. But every full moon, I would wait, yearning for the day when another unwitting victim would take my place, granting me the freedom that had been stolen from me. If only I had lit the candles. Is there anything from your childhood you distinctly remember that gave you an eerie feeling? Like, was there more to the story than you knew? Anything supernatural your family was hiding? If so, tell us a story by sending us an email at somethingscary@snarled.com.
Telling scary stories makes me thirsty, and I love to stay hydrated. Whether you hydrate to live or live to hydrate, Liquid IV quenches your thirst faster than water alone. With 3 times the electrolytes of a leading sports drink, plus 8 vitamins and nutrients for everyday wellness, all in a single sugar-free stick. My favorite flavor is the classic lemon lime. I just pop a little in 16 ounces of water right before I record the podcast, and it gives me a little extra boost to tell you scary stories every week. However you hydrate, grab your Liquid IV Hydration Multiplier sugar-free in bulk nationwide at Costco, or get 20% off your first order when you go to liquidiv.com and use code SCARY at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code SCARY at liquidiv.com. 20% off using promo code SCARY at liquidiv.com.
It's always easier to believe the practical explanation of something terrifying than to admit the truth about dangers that lurk around you. Like in this story inspired by Jasmine. When I was about 16, my younger brother was 13, and that's when the whole mess started. That's when he began having hallucinations. There was no better way of saying it. He was seeing things. Some of the things he saw were relatively harmless. Others were plain freaky. I remember he always had trouble sleeping. He was rarely asleep at a normal time. From as young as 5 or 6, we would go to wake him from school, only to find him already awake, having not slept the whole night. So when he started hallucinating, no one in my family was hugely surprised. The first time it happened, he was going to bed. It was nearly midnight when my mom and I heard him begin to scream. It was a scream that was bone-chilling, especially to hear from someone you love. We rushed into his room, seeing him scrambling to the corner of his bed, trying desperately to stay away from the foot of the bed. He started shouting, terrified. "Why is it here? The dog! The dog!" he shouted, pointing to the foot of his bed. My mom and I were obviously confused. We didn't have dogs at the time. I went and sat at the end of his bed, placing a hand down where he was looking, clearly freaking him out when my hand passed through the dog he had been seeing. My brother began to scream even louder. Mom picked up my brother, which wasn't difficult. He was incredibly skinny and scrawny for his age. She took him into her room, hoping that by leaving his room, what he was seeing would go away, and it did. But as they left, he looked over my mom's shoulder and shouted, "There's another one!" Once he calmed down, my brother explained what he had been seeing. There were 2 small dogs, spaniels apparently. Not scary, nothing wrong with them. He had just been freaked out because there was suddenly dogs in his room. The door was shut and the windows were locked. None of our neighbors had that breed of dog. Unfortunately, the dogs that my brother had seen were the nicest thing that he had seen. The next thing he saw emerge from the garden outside. A few months after seeing the dogs in his room, my brother hadn't mentioned seeing anything else until one night. He came barging into my mom's room, all freaked out. "There's a man digging in the back garden," he whispered. This was incredibly off-putting for multiple reasons. 1, if there was someone in the garden, why the hell were they digging? And 2, the garden was completely enclosed by hedges and walls. The only way to get to the back garden was through one of the sliding patio doors. So was this another hallucination? Or was this a person who had broken into our home? Jumping into action, I pulled out the light on the phone and ran downstairs. I started looking around the back garden. There was nobody there. There was no hole or any sign that somebody had been digging. My brother shrugged it off, and as if he had been sleepwalking, he wandered back to the bedroom and went to sleep. One day on the way home from the bus stop after school, I had my headphones on, listening to music. My brother was doing the same until, when we were just sat down the street from our house, he tapped on my arm. "Somebody's following us." I looked around as subtly as I could, not wanting to be one of those people who got killed because they were stupid enough to turn and look. But there was nobody there. We were the only 2 people on the street. My brother shook his head. "Not there. Up there," he said, pointing up at the roofs of the buildings we were passing. Pretty certain he was just seeing things, but too afraid to check, I got a hold of his hand and we ran the rest of the way home. That was the first time he started seeing things during the day. Up until then, we assumed they were nightmares, but now I'm not so sure. 3 years later, I came downstairs. It was a Wednesday, I recall. My brother was sitting in the living room. The TV was on, as was his phone, but he wasn't looking at either of them. He was just sitting, staring at nothing, his face blank and seemingly terrified. I asked, "Are you okay?" But he just shook his head. "I can hear the man in the garden. He's banging on the doors." Apparently, he had been seeing the man in the garden ever since the first sighting. He had always been in the crowd, making himself slightly taller or shorter so my brother would notice him. But until now, the man had never made any sound. It had always just been the sight of him, no noise. Handing him a notebook, I told him to draw me a picture of the man. Thought maybe he was seeing images of someone we knew. But when I looked at what he drew, I was horrified. I will never forget the picture. Then he explained it to me. The man in the garden has eyes so dark, I'm not sure he even has eyes there at all. They look like holes in his head. He's always dressed in tattered clothes and looks homeless, with messy hair and dirty fingernails. But his mouth, he has a constant smile. The corners of his lips go from ear to ear. I never asked him about the man in the garden again. That night, as the world around us slumbered, my brother's visions took on a new intensity. As I lay in bed, enveloped by the darkness, I heard his frantic whispers echoing through the house. Leaving the comfort of my room behind, I went into the hallway, heart pounding in my chest as I made my way to my brother's room, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Entering his room, I found him huddled in the corner, eyes wide with terror as he stared into the empty space before him. His words came out in a panicked rush, describing the grotesque man. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and told me that he spoke. He said, "Let me in." I tried to hide my own fear about the man, about my brother losing his mind. But when I went to the window to close the curtain, I saw a handprint on the outside of the glass. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe it wasn't just hallucinations after all. Have you ever had hallucinations before? Maybe when you were sick with a fever or overly tired at night? How do you know it was only a hallucination and not something from another dimension appearing to you? In 1572, the French were faced with the horrors of a serial killer in their own backyard. This is his true crime story, inspired by Reese. The stillness of the forest enveloped the quiet home of Giles Gardner, the hermit of St. Bonnet. He chose to live as far away from people as possible. Surrounded by dense trees and dark pathways, his cabin was falling apart, like it had been uninhabited for years, and it gave an air of creepiness. Giles, a recluse by nature, had retreated into the woods with his young bride, Madeline, seeking peace and quiet to begin their lives. However, the tranquility of their new life was soon shattered by the harsh reality of survival. Giles was only ever accustomed to fending for himself, hunting and foraging for one. He struggled to provide for his wife, their small provisions dwindling with each passing day. As hunger gnawed at them, they began to question the once happy union and wondered if this was something that was truly sustainable. Meanwhile, in the nearby town of Dole, horror was haunting everyone. Children were vanishing without a trace, leaving behind a trail of fear and suspicion in everyone's mind. What remained of the found children's bodies were just parts, like hair or just their flesh, as if they had been skinned alive and used for their organs. The work of only some type of monstrous creature, an animal maybe? Gossip and secrets began to spread like wildfire, as friends and neighbors who had known each other for years began to cast blame on one another. Panic struck in their hearts as distrust grew among the once tight-knit community. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and the authorities of the province issued an edict calling for the immediate arrest and execution of the alleged werewolf responsible for the heinous crimes. In the dead of night, under the cloak of darkness, a group of brave volunteers ventured into the forest, determined to rid their community of the predator and bring safety and order once more. It was on one fateful evening that their paths converged in a chilling encounter. A band of weary travelers stumbled upon a grotesque sight. A figure crouched over the lifeless body of a child, its features obscured by the darkness of the night. In the dim glow of their torches, some recognized the silhouette of Giles Gardner, the hermit of St. Bonnet. Without hesitation, they tackled him to the ground, tying him up in chains and dragging him back to the town to face justice. When accused, Giles stood silent, his eyes practically lifeless. The fact that he was found in the woods wasn't evidence that he was the killer. As the sun rose on the local court, Giles Gardner was put on trial for doing terrible things that were hard to understand. Sure, he was always a bit of an outcast, but no one would have pegged him as a serial killer of children. Soon, without real evidence, they would have to let him go. It wasn't until Madeline arrived that she convinced him to tell the truth. She seemed afraid of him. They both agreed it was terrible, but it might be better for both of them if he was locked away. With a scared look, he told the court about the deal he had made. "It was to protect my wife," he cried. All he wanted to do was provide for her, and when he was at his wit's end, he made a deal with a ghostly figure who said it would help him with his problems if he gave up his soul. He said that on nights when the moon was bright, he would turn into a wolf using a special ornament given to him by the ghostly figure. This made it hard to tell if he was a man or a beast. Giles felt sorry as he admitted to doing the awful things, terrible crimes that people would remember for a long time. But he felt almost as if it was out of his control, like he was someone else. The memory of his first victim, a young girl he tricked into going to the vineyard at night, made everyone listening cringe. As Giles shared more details about how he used the children as food, the courtroom became filled with shock and fear. People couldn't believe the terrible things he had done. The thought of Giles Gardner, the werewolf of Dole, made everyone feel scared and worried that it could happen to any of them. The trial went on for weeks, and more horrible things Giles had done came to light. He couldn't stop himself from hurting innocent people, and their cries for help couldn't be heard in the quiet woods. Madeline was counting down the days until the next full moon, wondering which night he would finally turn on her. But even though he did such terrible things, there were moments when Giles showed he still had some humanity left. When he spoke through tears, some actually felt sorry for him. He looked truly repentant for what he had done. As he faced the consequences of his actions, Giles struggled with the idea of his own death. On a cold winter day, under a gray sky, Giles Gardner met his end. He was tied to a stake, and flames burned around him, taking away his last moments on Earth. As the fire crackled, his screams filled the air, horrifying anyone with a conscience. And so, the story of Giles Gardner, the Hermit of St. Bonnet, the Werewolf of Dole, became a legend, a story people whispered about, a reminder of how fragile people can be when faced with survival. Do you think it's acceptable to do what you need in order to help your family survive? But at what cost? Do you believe werewolves are real? This week's podcast stories were edited by Sarah Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sindalo and Calvin Linderman.